So let's just touch on Mozambique's increase in the CPI number, sitting at 3.8% from the previous number of 3.5%. Is there anything to worry about? Because we know that what we see coming through in Mozambique is perhaps mimics in a way the increases that we also see here in South Africa.
This is actually the first increase in inflation that we've had in 7 months in Mozambique. So they've had a very sharp trend of disinflation over, I would even argue, a longer period than that, because the increase 7 months ago was only a brief increase. So we have seen very sharp disinflation in this period. So I don't think that this marginal increase is something to be concerned about. We have reached the trough of inflation. We are, however, expecting that inflation will remain relatively benign. There are some pressures coming through from the food elements of inflation because we have had tropical storms in the Mozambican coast, and we've also had droughts in other regions of Mozambique. So in line with seasonal trends, as well as perhaps a negative impact on food production, as we enter the harvest seasons, we are expecting food inflation to increase somewhat. But overall, we are expecting inflation to remain at benign levels, although upticking slowly.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, inflation that the central bank is targeting will remain in its target, or is likely to reach that rather, as they target a 12-month inflation of slightly below where it currently
Yvette,
stands.
this is very interesting because we see a very different scenario playing out for Mozambique relative to other economies in Africa and even in sub-Saharan Africa. What about the increase of fuel prices? How is this going to impact Mozambique going forward?
What we've seen in Mozambique is that they have had declines in their subsidies with regards to fuel prices. So we've already had increases in fuel prices over the past year that have fed through to inflation as early as the first quarter of 2011. Now, obviously, with sustained high levels of oil prices, this may feed through to transport prices as well as other elements of the economy over time. But what we are seeing is that the currency is significantly stronger than where it was over a year ago, and therefore its impact on year-on-year inflation may be somewhat subdued. So we're expecting the currency, or the central bank's preference, to remain for a strong currency, although perhaps not strengthening to the same extent it has done thus far, to ameliorate some of that effect of high commodity prices globally.
Okay, and we also know that there's the next MPC announcement is going to be made on the 9th of April, so basically imminent. The last rate decision that we saw actually dropped interest rates by 125 basis points. Are you expecting steady rates going forward?
We're expecting that there is some room for further easing of monetary policy. They have had a very cautious approach in terms of their response to this inflationary trend that we've been seeing thus far. So while they might keep rates on hold at this meeting, we do believe there's room for monetary policy to ease further over the next couple of months.
Okay, so let's touch on what we saw coming through from Botswana. Of course, fourth quarter numbers were released yesterday. Quarter on quarter, we saw the economy contracting by 5.8%. Year on year, however, we saw an expansion of 1.4%, but that's down from 7.1% in the third quarter. This is a significant drop. Are you concerned that we'll actually see the same trend continuing?
We are seeing some negative impacts on growth moving forward. What we predominantly had in the fourth quarter of 2011, that mining output fell quite sharply, and we know that is a significant contributor to GDP. So mining contributes around 30% of the nominal GDP, as well as close to that in constant terms. So its decline by 25% had a significant impact on the overall GDP figure. If we actually look, however, at the non-mining sectors of the economy, we saw fairly strong growth in other sectors, such as that of government services that expanded, which is the second largest sector, that expanded close to 15%, if I'm not mistaken, as well as we saw that wholesale and retail trade, as well as banking services, showed quite significant positive levels of growth. Where our concern comes for, obviously, moving forward, is that the central government has deemed a more tighter fiscal stance more appropriate. Therefore, its budget for 2012-2013 is very much on par in nominal terms with that of 2011 and 2012. Now, that in line with inflation that we were expecting to be slightly lower than last year, but nevertheless still at close to 8% this year. In real terms, government expenditure will decline in 2012-2013. So the positive contribution from government services is likely to be far more diminished in this coming year. Furthermore, we do see that there's limited scope for significant growth in the mining sector.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when you look at the overall growth contributions, and basically just reiterating your point that non-mining sector contributing around 70% of GDP in 2011 and mining only around 30%. Can we expect an increase in this going into this year? Could we expect a 40% contribution or even a 50% contribution, Yvette? I mean, what kind of historical figures are you looking at?
So 30% is actually the percent of total GDP, so that's its contribution to overall GDP, not GDP growth. If we look at its contribution moving forward, what we're seeing is that diamonds are likely to remain the largest contributor to mining production. However, there are other commodities that are likely to make a greater contribution in 2012. We're seeing development in the coal industry as well as copper, as well as potential for uranium. So we are seeing other commodities adding to the mining sector output, but its mainstay will remain the diamond sector. And in that sector, we're looking for fairly subdued growth in output in 2012. The other commodities will come off a very small base, so they potentially could have a positive impact on overall growth contribution in 2012.